Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hannah Webster, and I'm the Joint Head of People and Place Programme here at the RSA. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's special RSA online event. Over recent weeks, it's been impossible to avoid the conversation about the cost of living crisis and the pressure it will place on millions of our lives. The crisis draws out the worst of the systems that surround us, which push down the impact of global and national challenges onto the individual. Across the UK, people are facing rising inflation and particular pressures on gas prices. And as Jack Monroe's Vim's Boots Index highlights, rising prices for basics are not evenly spread, with those reliant on lower cost products facing an even steeper climb in their outgoings. Recent RSA work finds that almost half of young people are financially precarious. And in today's conversation, we want to explore how this is showing up in young people's lives, how it ties in with the bigger economic picture in the UK, and what can be done about it. There's lots to cover, so I'll briefly introduce our panel before we get started. From the RSA, I'm joined by my colleague Fran Landreth, researcher and lead author on our recent report, The Cost of Independence, which is part of a 3-year inquiry into young people's economic insecurity, and which she'll share more on today. We're also joined by Nairn McDonald. Nairn is a young advisor for this project, bringing his personal experience as well as his many hats as a community activist, experience as a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament, fellow of the RSA, and much more. We have Claire Reindorp, who is the CEO of Young Women's Trust, championing young women aged 18 to 30 living on low or no income. Claire has 25 years' experience in the charity sector, dedicated to tackling wide-ranging social and economic inequalities. And Anoosh Chakelian is our Britain editor at the new Statesman, where she also co-hosts their award-winning podcast. She writes widely on issues of UK politics, policy and social affairs. Welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really grateful for the breadth of experience and perspectives that we have in the conversation today. But of course, an event of this size can't go anywhere near speaking to everything or for everyone. Hopefully there's a lot we can cover together, but I'd also encourage anyone viewing today to join the conversation in the YouTube chat bar or to tweet using the hashtag RSA Cost of Living, which my colleagues will pop up there too. So first of all, Fran, I'd like to come to you. Last month, you launched the Cost of Independence, which is part of the RSA's partnership with the Health Foundation and explores the themes of economic security amongst young people and the impact of living precariously on their anticipation of the future. For full disclosure, I should say I also work closely with you on this project, but very much under your guidance and leadership. And I wondered if you were able to speak to us today a little bit more about this work and why you think the experiences of young people is particularly important as we explore the cost of living crisis.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Hannah, and it's great to be here with all of you today. First to give a little bit of context, as Hannah mentioned, at the RSA we're exploring young people's economic security as part of the Health Foundation's Young People's Future Health Inquiry. And when we talk about economic security, we mean the degree of confidence that a person can have in maintaining a decent quality of life now and in the future, given their economic and financial circumstances. So a lot is still unknown about how economic insecurity affects young people specifically. So in order to understand more about this, we carried out a survey last September of just shy of 1,200 young people, all aged 16 to 24 years old from all across the UK. And what we see from our research is that the current system is already failing young people, so even before the cost of living crisis, by not protecting their economic security at the time when they're becoming more independent and moving into adulthood. So we found that 47% of young people are financially precarious. That means that even before the rises in the cost of living, almost half of 16 to 24-year-olds were either unable to make ends meet, only just about able to make ends meet, or had a financial situation that changes significantly month to month. So sometimes they can make ends meet, but sometimes they can't. And we also found that young people become more likely to experience financial precarity as they get older within that kind of age bracket. So our data shows that financial precarity rises from 38% of 16 to 18-year-olds, so that's our lower end of our survey group, up to 48% of 19 to 21-year-olds. Before reaching a high of 57% of 22 to 24-year-olds at the kind of older end of that age bracket. And at the same time, as young people get older, we also see that they become more likely to be in debt. They become less likely to have access to their own savings, and they also become less likely to be able to access financial support from their family. So we know that a concerning number of young people today are already moving into adulthood with depleted resources and a weakened safety net. So you add to that the rising cost of living, and we can unfortunately assume, I think, that we'll see the number of young people experiencing financial precarity rising even higher. Another worrying trend that we found in our research is that work isn't supporting young people's economic security. So more than half of young people, 56%, who are in work are financially precarious. And maybe surprisingly, this is even higher for young people who are in full-time work at 63%. So almost 2/3 of that group are experiencing financial precarity. And we know that young people are disproportionately likely to be working in low-paid jobs, in the gig economy and on 0 hours contracts. They also have lower minimum income guarantees, with under 23-year-olds not eligible for national living wage, and under 20s earning as little as £6.83 an hour. So they're already in a particularly precarious position as living costs continue to far outpace wages, and that's obviously set to get much worse in coming months. And then when we look at young people receiving benefits, we find that financial precarity is even more acute. So more than 3/4, 79% of young people receiving universal credit, which is a group that, as we know, grew in size greatly during the pandemic, are financially precarious. So we see that the mechanisms that we have in place to provide a safety net clearly aren't working for a majority of young people already. And then the last thing that I wanted to touch on from our research is the effect that being financially precarious has on young people's confidence about their future and also the future of their generation. So in our survey, we asked young people how worried they were about different aspects of their lives. So that was from their financial, housing and employment situations, their physical and mental health and their future. And what we found was that young people who are financially precarious were more worried about all of those areas than those who are financially comfortable. And the thing that they were most worried about is their future, which 2/3 of that group were concerned about, closely followed by their mental health, which is probably unsurprising. And then when thinking about the future, around half of young people that we surveyed said that they don't believe that others like them would be able to do things like own a home, have savings to fall back on, earn enough to be able to support a family, or to be able to retire and live comfortably in the future. So what's clear is that in our current system, many young people lack confidence about their future and don't believe that they'll be able to have the kinds of stability that we might once have expected that we'd be able to have, like owning a home or saving for a rainy day. So while the cost of living crisis is a really urgent problem and people, especially young people, need to be actively supported in the immediate, there's also a longer term kind of risk and challenge that could come about for young people, which I think we need to be taking really seriously. So yeah, that's a quick overview of our research findings, which you can see in a lot more detail in our report, The Cost of Independence, which is on the RSA website. And I guess my final reflection is just that I think what's most concerning is that we carried out this research before the scale of the cost of living crisis was widely known or being talked about. So we can assume that without kind of appropriate intervention, that more young people will be forced into precarity, and that those who are already struggling financially, they'll face greater challenges. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Fran. There's obviously so much in there, and I'm sure we'll touch on more of it as we go. But I think what's particularly interesting is how there are really tangible and substantial reasons why young people are facing this crisis uniquely, and why it's so important that we tackle it as soon as possible so that their futures can feel kind of more optimistic than they might do at the moment. Nairn, you're a young advisor on this project, so you've been working closely with Fran on all the things she's been talking about. And you've also been involved in lots of work bringing the perspectives of young people into policy making more generally. I wondered what for you felt like the important considerations we should make when thinking about how the cost of living crisis is affecting young people, and any reflections you had on the research more generally.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. And I think it is incredibly important that we look at young people with this cost of living perspective. Young people are more likely to be in low security, low paid work. They're more likely to be in that gig economy that Fran spoke about. But they're also more likely to, either be living at home or to be in the private rented sector. One of the things that came out recently was around the Chancellor's attempt to offset the cost of living in the energy bills, was that £200 loan and payback. You get £200 off your energy bill, but then you have to pay back £40 over the next 5 years. you know, there are situations where students and young people are living in HMOs, or they're living in student accommodation, and their landlord will get that £200 off their energy bills, but each tenant has to pay back the £40. So the government are making money off of this. Young people are more likely to be in that precarious situation of work, but also, you know, you look at student support has been cut. It's less than it was 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Students are more likely to be in poverty. And I think what was really interesting about the research that Fran was talking about was looking at how it increases that precariousness, increases the higher we go in the age ranges. And I think that's because young people just do not enjoy the security that the older generation may have enjoyed. I will likely never own a home unless there is a huge change of circumstances. I will have to look at the private sector or the social homes. I'm 26 years old. I'm an unpaid carer. I'm looking to try and move out of the family home, and it's currently unavailable to me. You know, the local rental sector is extortionate. A social home in North Ayrshire will cost you £320 a month for a 2-bedroom. You look at that in the private sector, talking £600. That's completely unaffordable. And I think that's why this research is so key. It's bringing that youth perspective to it. Young people are going to be impacted by this for longer. And also looking at the kind of the cost of living in that more general sense. You know, if you are on a 0-hour contract, it's hard to plan to get over the cost of living. You know, if you're an older person and you have a fixed income and you have that security, you can say, right, I know I have this to spend on food every month. Let's shop around, let's go to Aldi or Lidl or some of the discount supermarkets. If you don't know how many hours you're going to have next week, you can't do that planning. So I think this is vital research, and I think it's an area of the cost of living which I think isn't focused on enough. Young people aren't spoken about enough as one of the biggest kind of victims of the cost of living. We see a lot around kind of the need to do more to help older people heat their homes. That's great. That is desperately needed. But what about younger people who maybe live at home, maybe younger people who are at university or college or in work and can't afford to heat or eat? You know, there needs to be that focus. I think this research really brings it home.
Thanks so much, Nairn, and I think you've led me in quite nicely to bring Claire into the conversation. So, as I mentioned up top, Young Women's Trust work focuses specifically on young women on low or no pay, and as well as offering services and support to young people, Young Women's Trust has been exploring the themes of precarity and insecurity. And your most recent report, One Size Fits No One, thinks specifically about the complex nature of how young people are unequally affected by global economic forces. You've spoken to the pandemic, but I think the cost of living crisis is another theme. I wondered if you could outline for us what you see in your work about the role that gender plays in the subjective experience of these issues, or even the material circumstances that young people face.
Absolutely. I mean, starting with the material circumstances, I think we should take one step back, and one of the really striking things that the peer researchers from the Young Women's Trust found when they looked at the official data sets is how scarce the data is here about young women. There's data about young people and data about women, and the invisibility of young women in the data reflects the invisibility of young women in policy making and service design. But what we do know from the data is 3 or 4, I think, really key things about the particular experience of young women. Firstly, is the pay gap. And I think there's a wide kind of perception that is an issue for middle-aged women, but actually the reality is it kicks in right at the beginning for young women. And the evidence is that young women are paid 8-9% less per hour than young men, but also that young women in their 20s are actually working less hours than young men. And you put the pay gap and the working hours together, and young women are taking home 20% less per year than young men. So there's an issue about young women being particularly at the sharp end of this in terms of their financial circumstances. I think the second thing is about the impact of unpaid care on young women. In this group that we're looking at today, we focus on 18 to 30 in the Young Women's Trust, but here your report's looking at 18 to 24, and a good number of those women will be carers of children, and we have the third most expensive childcare system in the developed world. And it is really the fact that young women can't afford childcare is holding back their participation in the workplace. And we had many stories in our peer research about young women telling us that they had to stay on universal credit working part-time, because if they came off universal credit and had more hours, their childcare costs wouldn't be covered. So it's really holding back young women's participation. And the third thing that we've seen in our research is the scale of economic abuse that young women are facing. 1 in 10 have reported to us that they've had some form of economic abuse of a partner or a family member using control or threats of violence to prevent access to them working or studying or taking their wages, benefits or money from them, and the way that the benefits system allows only one claim, universal credit per household, leaves young women particularly vulnerable to economic abuse. And all of that is coming together to show a really depressing picture really for young women of high rates of mental health worries, money worries, and concerns about their future, which really chime with the findings that you had, Fran, in your report, and concerns about what will happen for young women as they grow up and face more challenges, I might add, in terms of the pay gap and the deepening disadvantage. And really another story that we really should bring in here is the lack of data to divide the experiences of young women by ethnicity, by disability, and by where they live in the UK, because our emerging qualitative findings was that those experiences are really different, and the disadvantages is much greater for young women of colour, for those with disabilities, and things like the pay gap for different ethnic groups is much greater, for example, in the capital than in other areas. So there's a kind of granular picture here that is also not being looked at in the way that it needs to be.
Thanks so much, Claire. And I think that's absolutely something I've seen the Young Women's Trust do so well, is really clearly pull out the intersectionality in how these inequalities bear out within young women as a group that isn't homogenous and faces a lot of complex issues. And Anoosh, it feels like a good time to pull you in as well, because I think there is a difference between the individual experience and the individualization of the kinds of solutions we might come to. And young women and young people might face a lot of a sense of responsibility for overcoming the cost of living crisis. I was really compelled by your recent piece, which argued that actually, whilst there is a crisis, no one can deny that. By calling it what we do, a cost of living crisis, and associating it with just the very act of living, we already start to obscure some accountability about how we can move forward. So I wondered if you were just able to share a little bit more about that thinking and how we might better understand the economic picture shaping people's lives, their experience more individually.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks for mentioning my piece. The research is brilliant, and I'm really happy to have been invited to speak on this panel. And this is not to insult the RSA in any way, but the phrase cost of living crisis, although we all use it, and I as a journalist use it, it is causing some concerns among certain people sort of in the policy, particularly the progressive policy sector, and even in the shadow cabinet as well. So one shadow cabinet minister described it as a nonsense phrase to me because nobody outside Westminster actually uses it, and it doesn't actually immediately resonate with people. So part of the problem with the phrase is that it does sound quite clunky. Cost of living crisis is not how, it's not how a person would describe it if they suddenly got a bill through the door they couldn't pay, for example. So there's that problem with it, in that it's slightly sort of wonkish language, but also more importantly, what you mentioned and what I've written about recently is that it doesn't automatically draw a line to the reason why living standards are being squeezed. And one of those reasons is what a number of panelists have spoken very eloquently about, and that's that work isn't paying anymore. For many people, particularly young people. Those stats from your research, Fran, are absolutely shocking. So, and as well as that, the benefits system as well. So if you're claiming universal credit, that's supposed to be your safety net. And that's also, according to the government, for the people in the working condition part of it, is supposed to be your stepping stone to getting into work. But it's obviously not getting people out of poverty. So those two routes, working or claiming benefits or using benefits to try and get more hours to work, for example, none of those options are really helping people sort of improve their living standards. And so a phrase like cost of living crisis doesn't necessarily reflect that. It suggests that there's sort of this short-term, perhaps sort of like a global supply chain crisis that's affecting prices in shops in the immediate future, and we need a little bit of help to get through that sort of firefighting, but there's not these long-term and also structural issues that Claire spoke about. So it does sort of obscure that line of accountability. And sometimes when we use crisis language, when we're talking about even the NHS crisis and other kind of crises, the housing crisis, The problem with using that kind of language sometimes is it suggests to people that it's fated, that it's inevitable, that things won't get better, and that it's something that a government couldn't have planned for. It's this unpredictable kind of forces beyond our control, like the weather, that they just have to try and help us muddle through as best they can. That's not true. I mean, we've mentioned already many things that it is within the gift of government policy to change and to mitigate as well. Nairn spoke very well about the rather odd energy bill loan announced by Rishi Sunak, which really is, like he said, going to take money particularly out of young people's pockets who will be moving on to live in different housing in before 5 years' time and have to pay that £40 back a year, which they didn't benefit from in the first place. So that's just an example of one of many policies that, could have been better thought through for the well-being of the people that we've been talking about so far in this panel. So I've dedicated a lot of my journalism to exploring the cost of living crisis, but it's not actually perhaps the phrase that best exposes the predicament that people are in and have been in, for over a decade.
Thanks, Anoosh, and I don't take offence, though I do apologise. That I might use that term a few more times as we go through, but I think what you're sharing around the decisions of policymakers, and then your example, I think, is actually a really critical one, that don't either apply the lens of young people or even go further and invite young people into the conversation, who would quite quickly have flagged exactly what you do, Nairn, that this doesn't work for me, this doesn't actually help me, or at worst, it disadvantages me further. And I think that's something that the RSA is really keen on working further on. How do we include the participation and representation of young people, or those with the experience of the issues we're talking about, into decision making? Claire, you mentioned earlier your peer researcher network at the Young Women's Trust, and I wondered if you could share a little bit more about how you've been working with young women in your work, and also what ambitions you might have to embed that further into systems beyond your own organisation and thinking into policy making further.
Sure. I mean, we have an advisory panel of 30 young women who shape both the strategic direction of us as an organisation, but also go out and as influencers. And we have 30 media volunteers, young women who are speaking to government ministers and MPs, and really working hard to counteract the invisibility of young women in policy making and public debate. And our peer researchers have been doing research looking at the quality of experiences of other young women. Particularly, we initially looked at the missing data that we talked about before, and recently we've done the work on One Size Fits No One about the benefit system. And it's really rich, those insights from young women, and it adds alongside the kind of quantitative data sets that we've got about really what lived experience is. And I think it's increasingly common these days. Peer research, I think, is taking off as is kind of work with experts by experience, and I'm really delighted to see that. And some people doing quite imaginative things, like the Young Foundation using Kickstart money for apprenticeships to fund peer researchers to support them with their work, and we really advocating for that to happen more and more, so that we can really learn from what it actually is like to be at the sharp end of these, as you say, Anoosh, the sorts of structural problems that are happening, and how they funnel down to individual young women of different colours, different disabilities, living in different places, and get a richer picture, because there's rural and urban dimensions here that are very, very different, and they're different ages, different experiences for those who have got caring responsibilities. And so we have been, really enjoying listening to young women's stories and wanting to really broadcast them as widely as we can.
I really like that idea of repurposing the language of influencers as well. Kind of influencers for social good is a really nice way of thinking about it. And then you've been involved in the work of the RSA, but you've also been involved in projects bringing your kind of personal perspective for a number of years in various different ways. And I just wondered, from your perspective as someone who does participate in these kinds of conversations, why has it been so important for you to be involved? And why do you think we should think about it more than we maybe already do?
I think it's always good to have young people involved in policy making and decision making. I think they bring automatically a different perspective, and I think there's something inherently unique about a young person's perspective, whether we look at it the cost of living, whether we look at it of how they approach policy or how they approach their outlook to life. We know the young people are, for example, far more interested in fighting the climate emergency and taking proactive steps on that than older generations. So it's one of those things that I think young people always bring a different perspective through the roles I've been involved in, whether it's the Scottish Youth Parliament, being a community representative. I've met Secretaries of State, I've met Prime Ministers, I've met First Ministers, and the one thing that always strikes me is they're always very, very shocked to hear that, that young people are experiencing issues that they thought were only for older people or they thought were only for working people, because there is that ability within Whitehall, within Holyrood, within all kind of governmental organisations to think, well, this isn't a young person issue, this is a working person issue or a adult issue or an older people's issue. Well, actually, almost everything's a young person's issue. Rising rent are a young person's issue, the ability to have good working conditions and workers' rights is a young person issue, pensions are a young person's issue. I want to know when I'm going to be able to retire and if I'm going to get a pension at the end of it. National insurance rises, everything. And I think that's what people get when they get young people involved. There's suddenly that sort of, eureka moment thinking, well, actually young people care about all of this. And that's one thing I say in all organisations I'm involved in. I say, well, don't just class things as young people's issues because everything's a young person's issue.
And Fran, I guess from the other side of that project, where I know you've been trying to create as much space as possible for young people to be involved in the development of your work, I wondered if you'd share with us why you thought participation was so important, and perhaps if any of your work changed as a result of engaging with young people throughout this project.
I really appreciate what you just said, Nairn. I think all these issues are young people's issues, and I think it's we do a real disservice if we don't approach things in that way. And I think young people, like you say, will also always bring a different perspective into the room, and I don't think that should ever be overlooked. I think our kind of involvement of young people in the project so far has been really, really valuable, really beneficial. I've also really enjoyed getting to know the young advisors working on the project. I think in terms of kind of why that participation is really important, especially around work that's around sort of policy change, I think ultimately policy hasn't really adapted to match the world that young people are entering into today. And I think that is because young people's voices haven't been centred in a lot of those spaces or prioritised in those spaces. So, the world is different today for young people than it was for previous generations. But so much of what we do and so much of our policy making is based kind of on those old assumptions that just having a job is enough to give you security, that people will be able to find their way onto the property ladder, and then that those things kind of by default will be able to set you up for stability in the future. But we know that those things are increasingly inaccessible to many, if not kind of most young people, and that policy just hasn't really caught up with the reality of that situation. And I think also like that sort of mentality also seeps into the narrative and the rhetoric that we hear about young people. We regularly hear this really unhelpful, harmful, lazy commentary about young people choosing to spend their money on avocados, Netflix, flat whites, whatever it might be. These things will become a bit of an interchangeable symbol for why young people are the problem, from older generations who aren't living in young people's shoes and they're not facing the reality of what it means to be a young person right now. So without young people's voices at the heart of all of those conversations, all of those decision-making processes, and crucially, without a diverse range of young people's voices, wide range of perspectives in those rooms, we're going to stay stuck in that place where policy doesn't actually align with the needs of young people. And there's also kind of a wider risk in that, which is that the more we exclude young people from the decisions that affect them, and from the conversations about the issues that affect them, which, as Nairn said, is all things, the more we alienate and disillusion, a whole generation who don't feel that people leading the country understand, or maybe even want to understand, what they need to be able to live well. I think it's hugely important that young people can participate in decision-making processes around policy change, around all sorts of things. And as Claire said, I'm also really encouraged to see lots more organisations making that shift with things like peer research and stuff, which are really exciting approaches.
And I'm struck, there's obviously a lot of agreement amongst us about just how important young people's voices and experiences are. But obviously, a lot of the measures that are designed to support young people are falling short of this mark. Something's not quite getting there. Anoosh, you mentioned you've written kind of widely around issues of financial support for households and cost of living by another name. And the issues we've discussed for young people are obviously a big part of that. I wonder if you had any reflections on how we might motivate decision makers or policy makers to better engage with young people, or to think differently about how policy decisions are arrived at to help us move along, I guess.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because the cliche in politics is that young people don't vote, or at least some young people don't even have the vote. And so, you know, the motivation for politicians and policymakers to kind of meet their needs is, you know, cynically just not at the top of their agenda. And I think even with the sort of levelling up ambitions of this government to try and sort of rebalance opportunities across the country, I do think that there is a tendency to think of the red wall seats, the so-called red wall seats, as populated only by, you know, cranky, socially conservative retired people, for example, rather than sort of taking account of sort of the many young people living in these areas who desperately need those opportunities, new opportunities that they've been promised, and it would be good for the government to improve. So I think there's a problem with perception there. There's a problem with sort of Westminster truisms and received wisdom, and a sort of cynicism among the political class that needs to be fixed. And I think one of the good ways of doing it is this kind of research where you actually have those young people at your fingertips to give their own experience. It gives the research legitimacy. It also helps people like me as a journalist to actually speak to people who are impacted by the research. You know, I often receive a lot of press releases and reports, but there might not be someone sort of on the front line of whatever problem or social trend is being reported, who I could speak to actually hear from the horse's mouth. So I think that's really useful. And it's not just, you know, organizations using sounds very sounds very exploitative, but involving young people to do that. There has been a shift where I do really sort of notice that people who have experience of a certain issue are out there as the experts on it. There's something called the COVID Realities Project, where people speak about how the pandemic has affected them, particularly in terms of welfare, for example, which has put those recipients of welfare front and center in terms of talking about the problems that they've been through. And something else that I wanted to pick up on that Fran mentioned was policy for young people not catching up with the reality of the conversation. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I interviewed some young people who were working for delivery apps on 0 hours contracts, or, you know, the classic gig economy workers, and they'd fallen through the gaps in some of these schemes that Rishi Sunak had unveiled, which were very successful schemes. You know, the furlough scheme was a particularly good piece of policy, but they had fallen through these cracks because it was almost like the government didn't understand how the world of work works yet. And obviously young people are at the front line of that. Yeah, they're the ones who, you know, have been most impacted by unemployment during the pandemic, for example, and that is because, you know, the world of work isn't set up for them. It's not paying. And I think, you know, anything that can kind of show that, even from the business perspective, if we're talking about a conservative government, anything that can show that we're sort of losing potential, losing productivity, even, although it sounds very you know, hard-headed, would be a way of motivating policymakers and politicians perhaps to think about what they're missing from neglecting young people, and what they're missing from not catching up with the way that the world of work is changing.
I think you've spoken to one of the benefits that I think, as I see it, of involving young people is around bringing voices that might be in the minority. So I think gig economy workers are something between 5 or 10% of the workforce, depending on how you view it. So obviously that's a minority experience in the workplace, but it's a huge risk of precarity that is experienced there. And I think it's a really nice way of thinking about how you can involve a whole breadth of perspectives in the work. So thank you for sharing that. I'm drawn as well to that idea that participation allows you to think about a range of different experiences. Claire and Nairn, you both mentioned in your own way the role of unpaid care in thinking about the cost of living crisis and the effect it has on young people and young women. Nairn, if I could come to you, I just wondered if you wanted to share any reflections on how we can specifically centre the experiences of those with responsibilities for others or dependents in a moment where the crisis might feel looming.
Definitely, and I think that's the one thing that I think can be connected to all the sort of quote unquote cost of living crisis is, unpaid carers save on average in the country, anywhere between £2 to £4 billion, depending on what calculation you use. That's money that would otherwise have to come from NHS budgets and social care budgets and local council budgets. But in return, they don't get the support that they require. Unpaid carers, especially young unpaid carers, are generally not eligible for carers allowance. Carers allowance, you have to be 16 or over. You can't be in full-time education, and you can't work. You can't earn over, I think, £132 at the last count a week. So loads of young people are completely bombed out of that first rung of support straight away. You can get support from Universal Credit. A carer's element, that's £156 a month. But again, that is a minimal amount for what is a full-time job on top of studying and work and education. And again, universal credit is very, very tricky to get if you're in full-time education as well. And I think that unpaid carers often slip through the cracks, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Is one, no government has yet recognised the huge amount of money that unpaid carers save them, and that they need to be compensated for that. But also there is a huge swathe of unpaid carers that simply don't see themselves as unpaid carers. They see themselves as good sons or daughters or neighbours or family members. They don't see it as something to label themselves with. So we know here in Scotland we have hundreds of thousands of unpaid carers. But we also know that there is a good proportion of them that would not call themselves unpaid carers. They won't register with a local carer centre to get this help and support they need. And a lot of that is because if you apply and then you get carers allowance, that's great. It's £67 a week. It works out something like £195 an hour for 35 hours worth of care. Now, our paid carers aren't paid that much, but they are paid significantly more than that. And you look at unpaid carers and you can see how they are negatively impacted, especially when it comes to young people. They've already got all the issues that we've already spoken about on this panel tonight. They've already got all those pressures, but if you add unpaid care to that, that becomes almost untenable. Young people are at crisis point, especially unpaid carers, and the support just isn't there. And that's something that I think is highlighted in Fran's research is, the precarity of the economic situation of young people is very, very precarious. Add being an unpaid carer onto the top of that, I'm not sure that there's many that don't tip over the edge.
Thanks, Nairn. And if we had more time, I'd love to dig into that kind of idea of how do you meet people at how they see themselves to understand their issues, as opposed to add that language, like you say, that they might not associate with. Claire, I wonder if you had any reflections from your work around this.
I mean, absolutely. The gendered nature of unpaid work is something that has come to the fore, I think, in the pandemic. And we saw even pre-pandemic that women were doing 60% more unpaid work than men, whether that's cooking, cleaning, taking care of their own children or taking care of other family members. And in our peer research, we heard stories of the pressure on young women who are homeschooling, looking after older relatives, ferrying younger siblings around and doing much more of that work. And going back to the point about the cost to the economy of this, there's really interesting findings by McKinsey that showed that if we enabled women to fulfill their full potential in the workplace, we could add £148 billion to the economy by 2030. And when fathers work flexibly and share the childcare, mothers are twice as likely to be able to advance their careers compared to when fathers work traditionally. So there's a huge agenda here about how we shift the responsibility of care, both for youngest, it's both for childcare, but it's caring responsibilities more broadly away from women and younger women. And we know that there are places in the world that are doing this very well by, for example, paying decent parental leave to men and have use it or lose it parental leave that is properly paid. In places like Iceland, that means that men are looking after children and women are contributing to the economy and in the workplace at some of the highest levels in the world. So it's a problem that can be solved.
You have seamlessly moved me on to my final question for you all as well, which is that obviously we've covered a lot of the challenges, but I'd love to close off with a note of optimism perhaps and think about some of the things we might be able to do to improve young people's lives. I'd like to ask you the same question each, and please humour me because I know it is an impossible ask for just a few minutes. But I wondered if each of you had an important change you thought might improve young people's lives at this current moment, or maybe even a glimmer of hope you've seen elsewhere, like that Iceland example of where things might be done differently. You've come off mute. Have you got anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, a silver lining out of COVID is flexible working, as we've been talking about. I know at the moment flexible working is still the preserve of the higher paid workers, with 2/3 accessing it compared to 1/3 of lower paid workers. But I think there is a cultural shift, and with the employment bill coming up later in the year, I hope that we will get the right to request for flexible working for all workers from day one. Young Women's Trust and other organisations, we're pushing for that to go onto adverts so that workers know when they're applying for a job that flexible working is available to them. I think that will make a huge difference over time, particularly for young women with caring responsibilities joining the workplace. But also for young men, as Nairn you're talking about, with caring responsibilities, and will shift the dial, I think, over time.
Thanks, Claire. Fran, I know you covered some of this in your work as well. Was there anything from your perspective that you think would help improve the current situation?
Yeah, I mean, it is a difficult question. I think for me, what I'd really love to see is decision makers prioritising fairness for young people in policy. You know, it shouldn't be the case that young people under 23 aren't entitled to a living wage just because of their age. It's not fair that they receive less in benefits just because of their age, which is currently the case. You know, because the cost of living isn't lower for most young people. Gas and energy isn't cheaper for young people. A basket of food isn't cheaper for young people in the supermarket. Filling up your car doesn't cost less if you're a young person. Rent isn't tiered to mean that young people can pay less. So, you know, we can't assume that all young people are able to lean on their families for support. And even for those who can, I don't think we should be sort of forcing them into a situation where they have to choose between independence and economic security as they grow up. So yeah, that I would really like to see parity in our policies and a kind of real, genuine commitment to centering young people's voices and needs in decision making, and to understand what that actually looks like from their perspectives, and not just rhetoric, but genuine care from people who actually have the power to change things. So that's my hope. I'm hoping to see more glimmers, more opportunities where that's happening. But yeah, that's what I would like to see.
Thanks, Fran. Nairn, I'm sure you agree with much of that. Did you have anything to add?
You know, I saw a real glimmer of hope, and it is a very, very specific thing. But so we've talked about unpaid care, but maybe I've not spoken enough about kind of the impact of care experienced young people. But Mark Drakeford and the Welsh Government have just announced that they're going to do a UBI pilot for all care experienced young people. I think that is, I mean, I personally think UBI is really the way forward. We look at how we can fully support people, that gives them that extra flexibility and work that Claire was talking about, but also that freedom to do more with their family, to better their mental health. And I think the UBI pilot that Mark Drakeford and his government are piloting around care experienced young people as a very specific group of young people with very specific challenges. I think that could really be kind of the kicking off point for UBI pilots for unpaid carers, UBI pilots for young women, for young people in general. And I think that's where I hope the conversation is going. UBI has that opportunity not only to bring parity to what is a very disjointed and, as we've spoken about, a very hard to engage with benefit system, and make it something far more uniform and something that, you know, yes, the universality of it means that there will be people who are slightly better off that do get a wee bit extra, but actually that £1,200 a month for a care experienced person is going to mean 10 times more to that care experienced person than it will with somebody richer. So there's that balancing act to make. But I mean, I think that's a real glimmer of hope, and I'm hoping it's something that other governments follow suit with.
Thank you so much, Nairn. Anoosh, if you did have anything to add, please do share with us.
Yeah, I promise I'm not just going to nick everyone else's ideas. I think for me, from the reporting that we've done, one of the most important things that could really change the prospects and also the confidence, you spoke a lot about confidence in their future of young people, would be housing. It's quite a broken situation at the moment, but there are some, you know, really interesting, I mean, Nairn mentioned the UBI pilot, there are some really interesting pilots happening with housing as well. So one of our reporters went to a location in Peckham where they're building 33 houses, which are specifically for young people who have fallen into homelessness and who where the rent will be capped at just a third of their income. And he spoke to some of the people who would be living in these houses, and just the way that they were speaking about their futures was very different from some of the language that you heard, Fran, in your report. They were saying, I'm looking forward to saving, and maybe I can even save for a mortgage one day. That's not something I could ever imagine doing before. So I think changing obviously building more social housing would make a huge difference, but also changing the way that sort of the private rental market works would be particularly transformative for young people. Nairn said that young people are obviously more likely to live at home or be in the private rental sector, and so trying to make that more affordable for young people would make a huge difference, as well as trying to increase the housing stock in general. And that's, before you even get onto the idea of even owning housing, I mean, we need to change the conversation about that. I know that Kirsty Allsop said that her quotes were taken out of context, but there is that kind of intergenerational sneeriness about why young people, can't afford houses. But, it's something that should motivate politicians, particularly the politicians in government. What is a capitalist society if the next generation can't own capital? So I think, the housing is probably, for me, from the reporting that we've done, probably the most important policy area to focus on in terms of our young people's future.
Thank you so much, each of you, for rising to that challenge of solving this crisis. It's been a great discussion, and I'm sure we could have gone on for much longer today, but that is all we've got time for. I'd like to thank you all for talking to us and sharing your insights on how we might navigate what we know to be a difficult economic situation and put financially insecure young people at the centre of our responses. It can feel daunting to take on the challenges that are structural and complex, as we've discussed. I think there's so much space for alliance and collaboration between those of us in the room today, those of you joining online, and young people and others who are experts in their own experience. So to those of you watching, I do encourage you to keep up with the work of each of our excellent panellists, Anoosh, Claire, Nairn and Fran, and of course take a look at our recent report from the RSA, The Cost of Independence, if you haven't already. Please do stay tuned to the RSA's channels for more events like this and updates on our research work, and you can hit subscribe on the YouTube and visit the RSA website to find out what we're up to and how you can get involved. It just leaves me to say thank you to our panellists, that's Anoosh, Fran, Claire and Nairn, and to everyone who has joined us online today, and have a great rest of your day.